Hey everyone, welcome to another episode of Future Ready Leadership. My guest today, a repeat guest. Last time he was on the show a year and a half, almost 2 years ago, where we were talking about remote and hybrid work. And surprise, surprise, we're still talking about it. Dr. Nicholas Bloom, Professor of Economics at Stanford University. Dr. Bloom, thank you for joining me again.
Jacob, thanks so much for having me back on again. And yes, like you, I'm amazed this is still a topic.
Yeah, why is that still a topic? Because a year and a half ago, it was post-pandemic. There was a lot of debate. And like you, I kind of thought that, we would have this debate for a little bit and it would, kind of dissipate at some point. And it seems like today it's raging even more than it was a year and a half ago.
Yes, I actually think that in the media, as in if you read, the Wall Street Journal or the New York Times, it's still very much a topic. In companies and, talking to CHROs, CPOs and folks, it has certainly quietened down since 2023. So there have been a couple of things that have kicked it up. One is obviously Amazon in September 24, calling everyone back to the office full time. We should talk about that. The other that I think is less relevant, but generated a lot of headlines was the federal government.
Yes.
And the new administration. But I would not read that as a comment on fully in person. That was really a way to try and hope that people will quit their job, frankly. And so that's kind of a separate topic. It's generated headlines, but I'm not sure it's so relevant for
and it's also a little bit of a different animal because those are taxpayer funded roles as opposed to kind of like private organizations. So it's its own, and we can touch on that too because I also think that's really interesting. And what is it, 4.5 million government employees? Does that sound right?
Yeah, mostly they're in person already. So if you think of folks like in the vet or in the the military, etc. But I believe it's maybe something like 500,000 are in office jobs, and it affects that segment.
Okay, cool. Yeah, I'll make a note of that too, and I'll double check exactly how many government jobs we have because I thought it was 4.5 million, but I could be.
Maybe no, you're right. There's many millions of government jobs. I think most of them are frontline.
Yes.
So the number that are actually in DC or other cities in offices that are affected by work from home mandates is far a lot smaller. It's a bit like Amazon. So Amazon, if you look them up, I think has something like 1.8 million employees, but apparently only 350,000 of them are in offices. The majority are in warehouses, delivery, etc.
Yeah. Okay, so it seems like some of the reason why the debate has picked back up, and you're pointing out an interesting kind of difference between what's going on in the media versus what's going on inside of organizations. So maybe we can take a step back and just, when you look at the debate today, the in-office versus remote versus hybrid, it's been a year and a half, almost 2 years since we spoke. Has anything really changed? Has anything changed in the data? Has anything changed in research? Or are we still kind of where we were almost 2 years ago?
Well, in data, the number of days work from home, the number of folks swiping into offices, the number of cell phones seen in office buildings, all of that stuff is actually incredibly flat. Quite amazing. It really hasn't budged much since 2023. That's in the US. I also have some global data we just got in and we see a very similar thing. I actually think for companies, the consensus has pretty much solidified, and we can get into it in details, but basically 80% of Fortune 500 companies are now on hybrid for managers and professionals. What does that look like? That typically looks Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday in the office, Monday, Friday at home.
Okay. And I just double checked. It looks like 3 million government employees, at least in the United States. So I was off by.
That's very good.
Yeah.
Very close.
So what you mentioned, the three days in the office, I think you said, right? 2 days from home, or was it flipped?
Yeah, no, it's like ice cream. There are many flavors, but vanilla is probably 30 or 40% of sales. But with hybrid, there are many versions, but the most common by far is Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday in the office, Monday, Friday at home.
Okay, so 3 days in the office, 2 days from home, and you're seeing that to be very consistent across the board for a lot of organizations.
Yes. So if I was to give, yesterday I actually did an exec ed session with 50 execs, pretty senior from big companies. I would, one, say for most managers and professionals, hybrid's normed out. Why is that? Because you do need in-person time. We've talked about this before. You absolutely need in-person time for mentoring, particularly younger employees, for innovation, for building culture. There are some organizations that have less, but let's just set that aside because they're somewhat unusual. So the typical organization, like my own employer, Stanford, about 40% of employees are hybrid. But, they need 3 days in the office. It looks like once you've got about 3, And if they're the same 3 for everyone, so when you come in, or at least in your team.
Yeah.
So for me, I'm in the economics department. It's critical that I come in with my colleagues. It doesn't really matter if the English department's on different days. But so within your team, if you come in on the same 3 days, it looks like that's about enough in person time. And then the benefits that's kind of obvious from the days at home is, one is it's quiet, and actually it's better for deep work. And secondly, you're saving folks a lot of commuting time.
One of the things I find interesting, I find that a lot of when people are talking about the hybrid work research and flexible work research, to me, it seems like a lot of media, a lot of pundits are using it as a way to justify not coming into the office. And I don't know why they make that big jump, but a lot of people are so focused on the at-home aspect of it. Nobody's talking about the in-person aspect of it. And I'm really curious why. I mean, I even looked at your LinkedIn and you have a lot of really fascinating research and stuff that you highlight on there. But I find that so many people are talking about the flexible, the remote side, right? I'm still just as productive in this and that. How come you think we're not having more research and more conversations, not on the benefits of hybrid, but also on the benefits of being in the office? Because even what you mentioned, there's a lot of benefits to being in the office, culture, leadership, mentorship, but I don't see any of those conversations happening online. It's always about the benefits of not being in the office as opposed to the benefits of being in the office. So I think that's maybe why in the media, some of these conversations are so skewed, because we're just so focused on one side. I mean, does that resonate with you at all?
No, it totally does. I mean, if I was to, mention two, 3 papers I think are really, if you're out there and you want to persuade, a CEO or a senior manager for hybrid, but also why some days in office are useful. I mean, normally they don't need persuading on that, but there's a famous paper by Brooks and Levav in Nature in 2022, showing that innovation is easier in person. There are other papers showing that mentoring and learning, actually I have a field experiment running right now, is easier in person. Our Nature paper we had last June 2024, the key finding there is productivity once you have 3 days in person is, not boosted by having days 4 and 5. So we were, I was never suggesting fully remote. I was more suggesting once you get 3 days in, that looks like it's enough. The key other thing there is quit rates fall a lot. So I'm a bit, it's kind of like on LinkedIn, who shouts loudest tends to be advocates for fully remote. In the print media, if I think of the Wall Street Journal or New York Times or the BBC or something, or the FT, it tends to be the other side. It tends to be journalists like to tell stories because they get clicked and read and commented on, of Jamie Dimon's, David Solomon's. And both of those folks, David Solomon in particular, I've spoken to, are not as extreme as the media portrays. They're more balanced.
Well, and it's funny because I've seen several times even your name and your research used as a way to justify why people should not come into the office. And sometimes I see those things and I'm like, no, I've talked to.
Yeah, I had this discussion last week. An old friend of mine that lived in the Bay Area for a while, worked for Google, now is the CEO of a pretty big, like 3,000 person global firm, was saying 2 different employees came up to him and said, you know what, we should be fully remote. Look at this research by Nick Bloom. And he's like, I know him. And I saw him last week and I was like, no, for most managers and professionals. I mean, just to step back, take Stanford, my own organization, I can talk confidently about. We have 20,000 employees. Roughly 10,000 have to come in every day. They are security, food service, cleaning, transport, etc. You can't do that remotely. There's then 8,000 like me and most faculty staff that are hybrid. And, I'm at home right now. And I'm at home all day today because it's Friday, but I was in, actually all 4 days this week. And then there's 2,000 that are fully remote. And for them, it makes a lot of sense because they're doing back office, payroll, HR, grants processing. And for the university, it's a lot cheaper to have them fully remote because we don't have to pay for offices and we can hire them at a lower rate. But so there's no kind of one size fits all. For most large companies by now, you have a mix of all 3. And that would include pretty much, 80-90% of the Fortune 500 in that situation.
If you've ever wondered what good can come of AI in HR, this message is for you. The truth is, yes, a lot of AI solutions are a waste of your time, budgets, and bandwidth. HR and leaders need a smarter kind of AI, which answers your most critical questions about engagement, culture, and retention. Enter human intelligence from WorkHuman. By combining AI with the rich data of their #1 rated employee recognition platform, WorkHuman's human intelligence unlocks insights and capabilities that redefine talent management, cultural transformation, and employee engagement, elevating culture, performance, but above all, elevating people. Learn about human intelligence at workhuman.com and join their force for good. Again, that is workhuman.com. So it's safe to say Dr. Nicholas Bloom is not saying do not show up to the office ever. I'm going to clip that and send it to everybody who quotes and because even I've had people sometimes send me your article and say, see, we don't need to be into the office. And I'm like, no, that's not quite what he's saying. So I'm going to make sure that anybody who says that and cites your research from now on, I'm going to send them a link to this and make them listen to the conversation so that they get the full context.
Well, thank you.
So let's talk a little bit about the Jamie Dimon and Amazon and some other companies. The most popular video that I ever put up on LinkedIn was when Jamie Dimon said that he wanted employees to come back to the office. This was, I don't know, a month ago. And there was the leaked audio recording where he cited that the younger generation was being left behind, that there was a lot of bureaucracy, kind of he went off. And then there was a follow-up conversation that he did at Stanford where he kind of echoed these sentiments. And I put up a video on LinkedIn and basically defending Jamie Dimon and saying, look, it's his company. He's the CEO. He doesn't technically have to justify or explain anything. And he even said in the recordings, like, this is the culture that we want to create. We want to be an in-person company. And it's okay if you want to leave. There are lots of other companies out there. It's okay. You can walk with your feet. And so I put up this video online. It got, I think, around 6 million impressions now. People were furious, Nick. I cannot tell you how angry the comments were on LinkedIn, not just directed at Jamie, but directed at me, that I would even say something like this about coming into the office. People were going nuts. And I found it very interesting how angry people were that anybody would suggest the need to come into the office. So I'm curious to get your thoughts. When you heard that announcement from Jamie Dimon, what were you thinking? Like, what, did you agree with it? Did you disagree with it? Were you just kind of like, he's the CEO, let him do what he wants to do?
Yeah, so I was actually in the room in Stanford when he spoke. I was
okay,
actually
you were there for that.
Yeah, I was terrified because, on Stanford, I'm obviously known as the work from home guy.
Yeah, did he single you out and say, Nick, come up here?
Yeah, and it would be kind of embarrassing and a bit difficult. He was relatively moderate. So, like all these things, it's a nuanced view. So just to be clear, what I heard when he spoke in Stanford is you do need some in-person time. I agree. If I poll my undergrads, and I have, my two oldest kids are 19 and 21. And they're having summer jobs and about to start full-time jobs, and they want to be in person 4 days a week. They don't want all 5, but they want 4 because they want, get mentored, socialized, etc. So I think having, particularly for younger employees, mostly in the office is a good idea. There's a second issue that somebody's got to do the mentoring. So it's not just enough to have the newbies. There's got to be some middle managers. That's harder. You're asking people to come in that probably don't want to. So a 35, 40-year-old manager probably doesn't want to, but unfortunately, that's part of their role. Again, I wouldn't suggest they come in every day, but maybe 3-4 days a week. He's on one end of the spectrum. I wouldn't be that much on the spectrum in terms of favoring in the office. But for most roles, I think it's helpful to come in. Now, there are some exceptions. If I thought of, say, in a call center or maybe an elite Airbnb programmer, maybe you need to meet in person once a month.
Yep.
But typically, particularly for 20-somethings, this is why it's nuanced, because it depends precisely what you're doing and who you are.
Yes.
So there isn't really one size fits all, but to the extent there is, for managers and professionals, for the kind of folks I'm sure are listening to this, college grads, typically you're looking at hybrid, typically 3 days in, 2 at home. And that's, by the way, a lot better than it was in 2019, just to be clear. In 2019, it was 5 in, 0 at home. And so one of the things that came up yesterday in an exec ed session is, for HR folks and employees that want to keep that, it's important to make hybrid work, because the big enemy out there, if you like work from home, is the 5-day full return to the office. And what I've heard often is CEOs will say, look, hybrid isn't working. People aren't coming in 3 days. It's a mess. I just had enough. You're all coming in 5 days a week. And
Yeah.
so it's actually worth making 3 days work to protect the two, because there's definitely worse than, coming in three out there.
So when Jamie made that announcement at Stanford, and maybe I'll link to the clip in here because it was a very interesting clip, right? There was a student who came who got the mic and asked him the question about it, and then he sort of reiterated what he made in that kind of leaked audio recording about the importance of being in the office and stuff like that. Um, and I don't know, did the room respond well to that? Because at least on LinkedIn, the comments were he's a megalomaniac, he's crazy, he doesn't care about people, he's like just angry, terrible comment. And people forget that Jamie Dimon is one of the most respected and successful CEOs in the modern business world. I mean, what he's able to do with the company, he's led it through so much change, he's led it through very difficult times. I mean, he is respected by most business leaders as one of the top CEOs in the world. And for people to just trash him online about making this policy mandate, to me, I thought was very, I don't know, short-sighted and superficial. So when he was talking about this in person at Stanford and you were there, what was the general tone? I mean, was he, is he this
Well,
megalomaniac,
the,
my way
the,
or the highway?
the tone here, you have to remember that undergrads typically want to come into the office. Not all of them. Again, there is no one size
Yeah.
fits all, including politics. Look, we have, hard left and hard right on campus, but the typical undergrad is wanting to come in 4 days a week. The typical MBA student is wanting to
Wow.
come in 3 days a week. I've polled my class a few times. There's a range of hands, but that's what you're
Mm.
looking at. So I actually think the most important thing for companies, coming back to your point earlier, is being consistent, because in the long run, you can choose who you work for. The
Yeah.
biggest problem is companies regularly changing policy. In the National Survey of American Employees, we've surveyed hundreds of thousands by now. You see that 20% of people want to come in every day, 30% want the exact opposite. They want to work from home
Mm.
every day, and 50% are hybrid. So
Yeah.
the best service any leader can do is lay out a policy and just stick to it. Because over time, if you are fully in person, you are correct. People that want to be fully remote should just quit JP Morgan. They should go somewhere else. And
Yeah.
as long as he sticks to his policy, that's fine. The problem is if JP Morgan bounces around and Airbnb bounces,
Yes.
then you've got a lot of unhappy people in the wrong
Yeah.
situation.
I think that was the biggest challenge because at least what I've observed for organizations, there were some organizations like UPS, for example, or Northrop Grumman, and I've interviewed their CHROs, and most of those and many other organizations are now full-time back in the office. And when I interviewed them, I said, did you get a lot of pushback on it? And they said, no, not really, because we were very consistent with employees during the pandemic, and we told them we will always be an in-person culture first. This is a temporary shift. After we get through this, please expect to be back in the office. And so nobody had any false ideas that post-pandemic they were going to be remote full-time. Meanwhile, there were lots of other organizations who during the pandemic said, okay, we're going to be remote full-time, go move wherever you want, go do wherever you want, you can relocate. And then shortly afterwards, they're like, actually, we decided we want you back into the office. And understandably, a lot of these employees now are kind of like, what the hell are you talking about? I uprooted my life. I moved to another state. I moved to a place where it's lower cost of living. Now you're telling me to come back. What's wrong with you? And I think that speaks to the importance of being consistent in the type of organization you want to create, the values that you have, and the strategy that you want to put forward. And this is one of the reasons why I applauded Jamie Dimon, because he was very clear and said, this is the culture we are going to be from now on, in person, in the office. If you don't want to be here, you're more than welcome to leave. And I think more leaders should actually make that statement, not just about flexible work, but about anything. Who was it that recently came out? Google Gemini's AI team, I believe it was. And they said, you know what? Optimal productivity at this company is 60 hours a week. It's okay if that's not for you. You're more than welcome to go elsewhere. And several other CEOs have been coming forward and saying, this is what's expected. How we want you to work, where we want you to work, how many hours we think you should be working. And it is okay if that is not a good fit for you. No hard feelings. You're more than welcome to go elsewhere. Do you think that kind of because there's no misrepresentation there, right? You're not going to start working at a company like that and say, oh, I didn't know, because they're very clear with you. What do you think of that kind of an approach? Too much or something healthy?
No, I at this point, look, we're 2025. I'm totally on board.
Yeah.
I'm an economist, so We value choice, we value flexibility, and you get that if firms are very clear about what their policies are, and there's naturally going to be a mix. If put it this way, if every single firm required you to be in the office 5 days a week, you're going to have a lot of unhappy people out there that don't want it.
Yeah.
And so if one firm breaks and says, okay, look, you can come in 3 and work from home 2, they'll be flooded with amazing applications, and clearly it's highly profitable to make that switch. What you find, in steady state in the capitalist economy is there's a range. Much like there's a range of locations. Some people want to live in New York, so you work for a New York firm, and some want to live in Cleveland, etc. So
Mm.
right now, the key thing is consistency. I'm an advisor and an investor for a few startups. I mean, some of these are up to 50, 60 employees, and they are a mix. And the important thing for them is they've been consistent. 2, 3 of them are hybrid, and the rest are remote, and it works well for them. And I'm on board with that. I obviously, as an investor, want the firms to be successful. So
Yeah.
the thing that causes issues, and we had that at Stanford, to be honest, we kind of made that mistake that many people did in 2021. We hired a bunch of folks under the kind of implicit view that we would be fully remote, and we are no longer fully remote for those positions. And that was a difficult adjustment. And we made a mistake. In all honesty, we should not have kind of implied in 2021 we
Mm.
were going to remain fully remote. We would have been better off saying this is likely to be a remote for 6 to 12 months or 18 months, but after that, it will be hybrid. And if we'd done that, it would have been a lot easier, the adjustment that happened in 22, 23.
Yeah. I think a lot of people also forget that just because you're in the office, even if you show up every day, it doesn't mean it's not flexible, right? You could still be in the office every day and choose your hours. Maybe you're not there 9 hours, 8 hours a day. Maybe you show up for 2, 3 hours a day. So you can still have flexibility even though you show up to the office every day, right? I mean, you can show up at 11 or 12, stay till 3, finish work at home. So just because you are going to the office does not mean that you don't have any flexibility. It doesn't mean, for example, if your kid has a soccer game or if you have a doctor appointment or a dentist appointment, you can't go to your leader and say, hey, is it okay if I work from home today? I want to see my kid's soccer game, or we're going to be traveling for a few days for, a sporting event. I think the implication that a lot of people are assuming is inherent in these return to the office mandates is that you have to be there 9 to 5, no exceptions for anything. And I have yet to meet a CEO or hear about a CEO at any organization who is putting that kind of a mandate forward. I think it's more that they just want you there every day, but there's flexibility embedded within that. Are you seeing the same thing?
Totally. I was actually talking to a journalist last week. We were looking at traffic data. So one of the things you see in traffic data, which is, GPS from millions of journeys, is the morning and afternoon or morning and evening rush hours have spread out. And what's going on? I mean, again, I had a dinner a couple of weeks ago, a friend of mine who runs a pretty big organization here out on the West Coast was saying, I now take calls at home, typically from 7 till about 10 a.m. because that
Mm,
time's very valuable for talking to folks in Europe and on the East Coast. I then commute in, and I then have about 5 hours in the office, and then I come back.
yeah.
And he said, it's that morning flexibility. I mean, 2 other thoughts. One is you need to make it clear what the value of coming into the office is. So sometimes I hear folks saying, no one else in my office works, in my team works in my office. I'm the only one, say in the Los Angeles office. And in that case, it may not make sense to come in. So there is no one size fits all. But I think if there's a good reason to come in, say you are, co-located with your team and there's needs for mentoring, innovation and culture. The second thing is I think enforcement's important. And the reason is there's a big public good issue here. So imagine there's a team of 8 of us and one person, maybe called Jacob, for example, doesn't come in, says, look, I want to stay at home, I want to watch the Champions League, or maybe he does, he just doesn't say that, says something else. The problem is for the other 7 of us, if we want to have a meeting with you, we've now got to get on Zoom. And we're like, we've come into the office and we're on Zoom, and it's kind of annoying and it's irritating. And I understand if you're sick, that makes sense, but I would go back on in office days for the types of enforcement we had in 2019. If you're sick, your kid's sick, your car is stolen, your water pipes burst, we understand.
Yeah.
If it's just that, the commute is too long, that's not really, an acceptable reason by 2025 to not come in when your co-workers are. Because you generate a negative effect on other people. It's not just yourself, as you are, typically there to work with others, to mentor others, etc. And that is missing.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I mean, well said. Totally agree on all those points. Um, how do you see or envision this playing out? Right. I mean, are we going to have this conversation again in 2 years, and the debate's going to be just as big? Are you seeing some sort of stability with the 3 days? at home, or I'm sorry, 3 days in the office, 2 days at home? Do you think that's where we're going to end up? Or is it going to be
Yeah,
kind of what
it's
you alluded to, just a big
things
mix?
seem pretty stable now. I mean, the reason it's in the headline, the Amazon September 2024 move was, I think, primarily about reducing headcount. So if you look at Andrew Jassy's memo, it quite clearly talks about being too big, needing to downsize, having too many layers of middle managers. I think their view is, look, if we require people in the office 5 days a week, we maybe see 5-10% additional attrition.
Hmm.
So you can argue whether that's good or bad, but notice that very few other firms have copied Amazon. That happened now more than half a year ago, and there's really not much follow on. The federal government, that happened in January 2025, was a similar motivation, and really no one's copying the federal government because governments are not typically seen as well managed. I've never heard a private sector organization. So they've generated a lot of media debate, but they haven't generated much imitation. So I think a 3-2 is settling down. The only thing that I am seeing trending is somewhat greater enforcement. And I actually,
Hmm.
when I talk to companies and employees, say enforcement is probably even in your interest because the big baddie out there is the 5 day in the office. And the kind of comments you hear from CEOs is, look, we asked for three, we're only seeing 1.5. I want three, so I'm going to ask for five and expect three. But
No.
asking for five and expecting three is not a good outcome because what it means is when you're at home, you're nervous that you're going to get in trouble. When you do come in, half your colleagues aren't there. It's a kind of mess. So you're better off to ask for three that are the same 3 days and just enforce it. And then you're 2 days at home. Everyone should be there. There's nothing wrong. There's no hiding anything.
Yeah.
So that's the enforcement and organization I do see picking up now.
Are you seeing? I mean, I haven't seen this yet from any companies that I've talked to that have been more strict or stringent with return to office mandates as far as losing talent. I mean, most of the CHROs that I've talked to and have interviewed, they say, nah, maybe a little bit here and there, but by and large, it's not a significant impact as far as us losing talent by mandating employees to come back to the office. Is that pretty consistent with what you're seeing? Have you heard of any company, for example, say we're going to mandate employees to come back to the office, and all of a sudden they lose, you know, 20, 30% of their workforce, their top talent is just leaving and saying the hell with this? I haven't heard any of those stories.
Well, to explain my answer, no, I haven't heard explicitly. Just to explain my answer, people value hybrid about the same as an 8% pay increase.
Yep.
So there's lots of surveys, there's experiments, there's all kinds of different ways of getting that number. It's actually a pretty robust number, 5 to 10%. So it's the same as basically a pension plan. So imagine you took a company and you abolished the pension plan. What do you think would happen? Would a whole bunch of people quit on the spot? Probably not. They'd be annoyed, angry about it. You would just see higher attrition rates over the next 3 years and it harder to hire people. And 3 to 5 years from now, the quality of your employee for your, pay rate would be lower.
Hmm.
And I think that's going to happen to Amazon. I mean, oddly, the biggest beneficiary of the Amazon announcement was Microsoft. Microsoft is, same industry, same town, and is, over the moon because they're getting a whole bunch of high quality Amazon AI and other kind of shortage area employees that want to remain hybrid and switching to Microsoft. So in the short run, no, it's probably not going to lead to a flood out the door, but 3 to 5 years, you're clearly going to see a cost in terms of, human capital in the firm.
Yeah, I don't know if you saw this article, I think it was on Business Insider, where it basically said something to the tune of, playtime is over. And this is something I wrote about years ago, even during the pandemic, because what I saw is that a lot of companies were just going crazy with perks and benefits and work from home and salary increases for everybody and bonuses, regardless of performance. Everything just went out the window to try to keep employees at the company and to try to bring new talent in. And now this article on Business Insider basically said specifically tech companies, they are stopping all of that. They're removing perks. They're removing some benefits. They're increasing expectations. They're, to the point of the article, playtime is over. And so part of me wonders if that is also including this idea of flexible work as well. I mean, have you seen any of the organizations that you're talking to basically say, hey, we're going to be focusing much more on, the business metrics instead of the satisfaction metrics of employees?
Yes, in the sense that that has made hybrid more popular. So the evidence seems to
Mm.
be if you're a reasonably well managed company, so you're not actually watching whether people are physically sitting in their seats to do they get their job done, but you evaluate, say, output. You don't really need them in all 5 days. So fully remote has definitely shrunk, and there's a view that look, we want you in 2 3 days a week. The very few, I mean, Amazon aside, and I think that's driven by the desire to reduce headcount. it's really hard to think of other tech firms that are forcing folks in 5 days a week. So yes, I've heard all, yeah, I know I'm at Stanford, so you see it directly. The
Yeah, you're
CS, the
right there.
computer science major, is less popular now because the students are realizing there's less internships in tech. It's harder to get a job. Kind of tech winter is here a little bit. And yes, perks are down and pay increases are down and bonuses are down. But mostly firms are not canceling hybrid because it's a lose-lose. It's a lose in a sense it doesn't particularly improve performance. And it's a lose that for a given amount of money, it's harder to retain and recruit talent. And even in a tech winter, I quit my job at McKinsey actually not far after 9/11. That was a recession. Even in recessions, people leave jobs and change. So it's not, as soon as a recession or a downturn in your industry, you should start being horrible to everyone. You still want to keep your employees. It's a little easier.
What do you think of the arguments that some of the CEOs like Jamie Dimon are making, or the CEO of Amazon, for getting employees back to the office? Because to me, it seems like a lot of the arguments are, yeah, maybe there's a part of it is we want to have some voluntary turnover. But Jamie Dimon was very clear in a lot of the different aspects that he was alluding to, right? He said collaboration was struggling, the younger generation was being left behind, that people were not working, they weren't really on Zoom calls, they were doing other things, they was making more bureaucracy. Do you see validity in some of those CEOs who do want employees back to the office 5 days a week? Or do you look at that and just say you're out of touch, you're crazy, you're nuts?
No, I didn't see Jassy ever really justify it, but Jamie Dimon, yes, I saw him speak. It's hard to distinguish between the reasons for 3 or 4 versus 5. So everything you just said could also justify hybrid. So typically, folks pushing for 5 days beat up on 0, but it doesn't mean that, if 0's maybe not ideal, it doesn't mean you immediately jump to 5. You don't need to be one extreme or another. It's kind of like our politics has become very extreme. We don't need our management to be very extreme too. And so, he's the CEO, he runs the business, so I don't want to double guess him. And like you said, JP Morgan's been very successful and their stock return's been, I don't know, benchmarked against competitors, but it's done well overall. I would be surprised if going to 5 from 4 is really that valuable. You'd think once you're in 4 days a week, that's a lot of mentoring and culture building and innovation time. And that final 5th day, typically Friday, at home may be useful for doing expense reports, catching up, talking to other offices. One of the things you find that when people are home, it's actually easier to have cross-office conversations and international things. So, but again, he's the CEO. I don't typically want to double, guess any one firm, but on big trends, what I see is hybrid is dominated. 5-day returns is actually relatively rare.
Okay. Yeah. And maybe to your point, he's, making that statement to try to end up at some sort of a balance, or maybe it's 5 days, but flexibility with those 5 days, which is there any data comparing flexibility of 5 days in the office versus 3 days in the office? So for example, if I'm in the office 3 days a week, 9 to 5, versus I'm in the office 5 days a week, but maybe just a couple hours each day, has there been any comparison there as far as satisfaction, productivity, engagement, performance, promotions, or has that not been
No one's done the micro. I mean, the one thing I would point out is when you survey folks and ask them why they like working from home, number 1 is avoiding the commute, and number 2 is avoiding having to get dressed and put on formal wear and leave the house. And then both those 2 disappear if you have to come in for 2 hours a day. So generally, you would think the benefits. Now, it doesn't mean on the 3 days you're in, to your point earlier, you need to come in for the whole day. But a classic hybrid may be, particularly out, say, on the West Coast, even on the East Coast, if you're going to work with Europe, is you actually come in maybe at 10 a.m. because you're taking a couple of Zoom calls in the morning with Europeans, which is too early to come in for. And you work, and then maybe you leave at 4 and try and avoid the commute. But you're there 10 to 4, that's 6 hours. That is enough time to have lunch, meetings, events, presentations with co-workers, and maybe go out after work one day. That would be a very standard type of policy.
HR just changed for good with the introduction of human intelligence. By combining AI and the uniquely authentic data of WorkHuman's #1 rated employee recognition platform, Human Intelligence helps you discover what good looks like in your company, with previously unobtainable insights into skills, performance, culture, and more. Human Intelligence also helps coach employees on what good peer-to-peer recognition looks like, turning every good job into better engagement, retention, and well-being. And It helps surface feel-good stories that illustrate the best of your company culture. In short, it's how today's leading companies are turning AI into a force for good. Learn about human intelligence at workhuman.com. Again, that is workhuman.com. And by the way, as we were talking, I asked for kind of the stock price performance over the past 10 years for JP Morgan Chase compared to competitors. So Bank of America, Wells Fargo, Citigroup, Goldman Sachs, and JP Morgan Chase. And I'll let you guess which one is far away and ahead. So over the past 10 years, JP Morgan had a total return of approximately 448%. Bank of America 243, Wells Fargo 77, Citigroup 85%, and Goldman Sachs 131%. So not quite double its closest competitor at Bank of America. Actually, almost double the second its competitor, because B of A was 2 something and JP Morgan was over 400. So clearly he's doing something at that company that is working, because he's outperforming pretty much any other financial institution in his area. So yeah, it's hard to second guess a CEO who's having such great performance on there. One of the other things I'm curious about, there's been an interesting trend of employees who are now asking CEOs and leaders to justify things, which we didn't see before, right? I mean, if you look a Jack Welch, a Steve Ballmer, a Steve Jobs, if they told you to get in the office, you weren't challenging them and saying, prove to me that I need to be back in the office, right? Because you wouldn't have a job. Today, it seems like more and more, a lot of employees are wanting to push back against leaders to, you tell me why I need to come back to the office. Well, because I said so. No. I want to see data and a research on why I need to be back to the office. And some CEOs that I talked to, most recently, David Sable, he is the former CEO of Young and Rubicam. He's now a VP at a company called Stagwell. And I was having a conversation with him about this. They have over 10,000 employees. And I said, what do you think about this? And he's like, no CEO in the world should have to justify or explain anything to their employees. You're the CEO. If you tell employees to come back to the office, they should come back to the office. And if they don't want to, they don't need to have a job. Where do you stand on this whole explain to me why I need to do this? I need data for why I need to be back in the office. Have we gone too far with employees being able to kind of ask and justify these things?
I mean, I think the reason to try and ask and justify is a lot like the reason you hear repeatedly in medicine, which is if you go to your doctor and they tell you to take these pills, you may or may not follow the instructions. If they tell you why you should and how it will help you, you're much more likely to follow it, and it's more successful. So I've seen, when I was in consulting, it was much more likely that a client would implement your advice if you explained to them why it was useful and how it would be helpful. So for CEOs, of course, they are under command and control, and they can tell you if you don't listen to their advice that you're going to fire them. And, that may work, but you're probably going to get higher compliance with whatever you want to do and greater buy-in if you also explain at the same time, because it kind of stalls any type of pushback. So if it were me, the more that I could explain my reasoning, the better. Now, I don't have to, but it's going to mean that my, not so much orders, but my mandates are more likely to be complied with.
Yeah. The other interesting thing, I think when we spoke 2 years ago, AI was not anywhere near where it is now. In fact, I don't even remember what version of ChatGPT. We certainly didn't have ChatGPT 4. I don't remember. Do you remember where we were last time we spoke? We didn't have ChatGPT anywhere near where it is now. Grok, I don't even think, maybe Grok 1. So it's really fascinating to see now, and even a few days ago, right, they just made a huge upgrade to ChatGPT for images and infographics and design and creative work. How do you see this playing a role in hybrid work, if any?
So AI is a big deal actually from work from home for one part of it, which is fully remote. So if you step back and take a very basic view of physical versus software, hardware versus software, AI is all about software. So there's been incredible advances in software, and we're getting close to the point that with a bit of time, you could almost simulate a Nick AI on Zoom, and I could almost fool you. And the stories of people being fooled and conned by this. Hardware, we're, 1 or 2 decades behind. There's no physical robot that looks remotely like me. Terminator still very much science fiction. And to the extent robots exist and it could be in the classroom, I think, they're vast, clunky, and they clearly look like robots. What that means is if you are fully remote, there is definitely some risk of that job being replaced by AI. So already employment in call centers is falling because of replacement by AI. I was just listening to actually a podcast about a paper earlier today whereby they're augmenting employees in call centers with AI suggestions. They've not been replaced, but the AI listens to the customer and gives you suggestions. You can imagine it speeds it up and it reduces the number of employees you eventually need. So I think 5 to 10 years from now, it's quite possible fully remote employment as a share of all employment is actually down because it's replaced by AI or some extent offshored. Hybrid I see growing because AI is typically more of a complement, and there's no empathy and creativity and in-person canceling employees that AI can do, and the same would be for most in-person jobs. So I think it's a threat to fully remote, particularly non-creative fully remote. So if you're in a data entry payroll, that's a worrying place to be, certainly looking ahead 5, 10 years.
Yeah, I think any task-based oriented roles, and even task-based oriented roles, I think are good to. I mean, one of the things that we didn't talk about that relates to this is sort of the expectations that you have for your role and the expectations that the company has of you, right? If you are, for example, in a call center and you're simply doing task-based oriented work, and you want to stay in your current role and have no aspirations of movement ever, which I don't know many people who have that, then yeah, don't show up to the office. But at least what a lot of leaders have expressed to me is that as an employee, you should want to be in the office. You should want leader time. You should want the coaching and mentoring. You should want the visibility from your peers. And so there's a lot of benefit to your point of being in that office. But yeah, for task-based oriented work, if you're a call center, you're crunching numbers, you're even doing creative or design work. I mean, imagine ChatGPT next year or in 2 years from now. What role, what purpose are you going to serve? However, if you are, for example, a call center employee and you're really good at training, you're really good at motivating your employees, you're really good at supporting them and getting them to be better, or maybe you're a creative person, you're really good at inspiring ideas from others, right? Now you have a lot of value you can bring to the organization, and there's a lot of value to that in-person element there. So I think you're right. It'll be very interesting to see over the next few years the role that AI is going to play in this.
Totally agree. Yeah, that's probably the next big change. Just funny, from 2020 to kind of 2025, I often would do speaking events for VCs, private equity firms, companies, talking to groups of, their portfolios or groups of execs. And often I was paired with someone that's going to talk about AI. It was noticeable that they said the two big themes right now for HR leaders or leaders in general are work from home and AI. And I think work from home is now settling down. Finally, I feel like 2025, it may be reaching a consensus, and potentially AI is becoming more and more frantic, the pace of change.
Yeah, I totally agree with you on that. So what's going to be coming next? Again, a lot of debates are still happening. Are there, I don't know, specific strategies that you're seeing organizations implement? You alluded to, for example, having employees on a particular team in the office consistently at a set time. Besides that, are there any other specific strategies that you're seeing organizations implement that can help make this more of a reality?
Yeah, I mean, to summarize, there are three things I always advise HR leaders to do. So one is coordinate. We kind of discussed that, but coordinate either team by team, whatever group people work together, they should coordinate on the same days. And that may be Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday. Second is I'd actually make sure those policies are enforced. And so they're enforced with about the same rigor as you might have in 2019. And that probably includes measurement.
Okay.
So I'd probably, using swipes or Wi-Fi, make sure people are coming in on the 3 days. There's an old Roman saying, a good law is an enforceable law. So you have a sensible policy, you can typically enforce it. If you're asking for 5 and no one agrees, you're going to struggle. Yeah. So 2 is enforcement. And then 3 is focus on performance rather than desk watching. So when people are working from home, say 2 days a week, you can't see what they're doing, which means the only way to evaluate them, you don't want to be checking how fast they reply to email or Slack message, just what they achieve. So it's a bigger focus on performance reviews, and that's actually better for employees. So Jacob, if you're my boss, if you say, Nick, you're going to get, meet these sales targets, deliver this report, and, do this overhaul. If I want to go play golf or pick my kid up, I can do that in the morning. I just have to make up for it in the evening.
Yeah.
So, coordination, enforcement on a reasonable policy and performance reviews are the three things. And I see those all going in. I mean, this is, the way the wind is blowing across most organizations I talk to.
Is there an official definition of hybrid work? So, you mentioned like 3 in the office, 2 from home. But for example, 5 days in the office, but picking your hours and maybe not showing up every day if you have, an important event. Technically, that would be considered hybrid work too, right? Or does that not fall in that same?
I mean, not classically. That's kind of what you'd see in 2019. So just to give you a number, in 2019, 7% of full paid days in the US were from home. So even in 2019, typically once or twice a month, the average employee once a month was working from home. Now it's gone from 7% to about 25%.
Okay.
So it's much more common. It's gone on average from once a month to roughly once a week. Yeah, that once a week spans a mix of fully in person and some people that are on 2 or 3
But that's
days.
measuring day, not hours, right? So for example, because I guess maybe
Yeah, it's measuring to get that. There really isn't good data on hours. I would suspect, like we discussed earlier, hours in the office, even on in-office days, are less because people are now more willing to work from home in the mornings than the evenings, and bosses are more accepting of it.
Yeah.
If I was to tell you, hey, look, I'm in California, I've got to speak to the French office, that's 7 a.m., that's 4 p.m. for them. I can't call at 7 or 8. Beyond that, I don't want to come in the office for that time. Are you okay with me taking 2 or 3 Zooms and coming in at 10? You'll like to say yes.
Yeah, because you could work 3 days in the office and spend just as many hours in the office as working 5 days in the office, but fewer hours and more hours at home. And so I'm actually really interested in the hours as well, not just the days too. I wonder if, we got a lot of research. We could...
I can tell you the paper had in Nature, and that experiment, we didn't report it in the Nature paper, we reported it in an earlier working paper, an MBR working paper. You saw for the folks in trip.com, the days they're in the office, their total hours, including actually home time, were longer, and the days they're at home were shorter. And what was going on was they said, look, in that case, they were working from home Wednesday, Friday. They said on those home days, that's a useful time to say, go to the dentist or go shopping or get the plumber to come and fix my broken washing machine. And so, of course, I do a little bit less work, but I make up for it on my work days and the weekends. So hybrid workers actually were working about an hour and a half more on the weekends, but less on their work from home days, which is why it's slightly tricky. You want to look at ultimately performance or work across the whole 7 days of the week.
Yeah, that's also challenging is how you measure work, right? Because a lot of these assessments, my understanding, are self-assessed, right? Or unless somebody is very much in like a call center or something like that, doing task-based oriented work. But for example, if you're in a leadership role, if you're in some sort of a role where either you can't measure your output directly daily via lines of code, via phone calls that you make or something like that, I guess the best that you can do is a self-assessment. So is there a little bit of a self-selection bias for employees in those assessments who are just saying, yeah, I'm more productive at home. I love working from home. I'm more engaged at home, but without having kind of like the objective data behind it?
So you're right that we wouldn't, in that study, we did not rely on self-assessment. So we actually did ask survey people and they claimed to be better, but that was not the main metric. The main metric was they have 6 monthly performance reviews by their managers. They have 6 monthly promotion outcomes. They had leadership scores, innovation scores, and for coders, they did have lines of code written. On all of those metrics, we actually didn't see any difference between 3 days in the office, as in hybrid, and 5. So it wasn't better and wasn't worse. The numbers I was talking to, we also know the hours work because you can tell when their laptops are connected, including when they're VPNing at home and when they send messages. So you have a pretty good measure of, now that doesn't measure performance, but it measures hours of work. And that's where they look more like students. I teach at the university, and what you'll see is students will not work for 3 days and then pull 2 all-nighters and then not work again. And I'm not saying that's the best way to go, but the more people are hybrid, the more they flex a bit around. And some flexibility is good, but I have to say having many students, too much flexibility can be bad. So there are students that don't very successfully manage to ever pull the all-nighters. They just don't get the work done.
Yeah, I mean, that's, I went to UC Santa Cruz and I can certainly relate to a couple of those all-nighters on some caffeine. Just to pass the test or pass the final and then kind of go back to your way of life. So I I totally get it. So in the last few minutes here, what advice do you have for organizations out there? And the in-person work, I thought maybe we can end on that. The value of people being together. What is the value of employees being there? Whether we look at promotion, collaboration, innovation, you kind of alluded to some research that was done earlier, but it does show, it seems like, according to you, that there is value to being in the office. There is value in a lot of these different aspects of work. So can we unpack some of that a little bit more in terms of what you found? Because I want people who are listening and watching this to not walk away again saying, well, Dr. Nicholas Bloom said I never need to be in the office again.
So I think there's two groups. One is own value. So if I come into the office, what's the value to me? And normally you see I'm more likely to get mentored. I mean, I'm 51, so there's probably less of that now. It's easier to innovate. For me, it's easier if I'm face to face, often having discussions, and it also helps to build culture and connections. There's a second set of values, which is somewhat more problematic in the sense of motivation, which is value to others. So if I'm in the office, it's valuable to my students because I'm more likely to mentor them. I'm more accessible. It's value to co-authors. Innovate with them. It's that second bit that is why firms need some management of the overall process. Just to give you an example, law firms I've heard this repeatedly from law firms where they say the junior associates, the new hires, want to come in 4 or 5 days a week, but the partners don't. The problem is the junior associates want to come and say, want to get mentored, but someone has to do the mentoring. And so the partners, part of their role is not just dealing with client work, it's also training the next generation. And if you have a system whereby you're paid 100% on client billing, you have no incentive to come in and train the next generation. And so an HR solution to that is to place, say, 80% of comp based on client billing and 20% of comp based on what I was assessed on in part when I was at McKinsey, which is on, developing talent. And if you do that, suddenly you get partners more willingly come in because they realize that's how they get, strong performance appraisals. But without that, you have this, management or, missing performance component.
Yeah, there was another study that was done, oh man, I can't remember, maybe 2017 or 2018, that found that if you are working within 25 feet in person of a high performer, your performance will also go up. And similarly, if you are in 25 feet of an employee who's quote unquote toxic, your performance will go down. So who you are around makes a difference. And you can also see why there could be potential ROI if you're showing up to work and you're around other high performers. It could positively impact you and your career trajectory and your promotion and stuff like that as well.
Totally. There's a great study on that, Natalia Emanuel and Emma Harrington, where they look at a large software company and they do an experiment of people working from home in the office and whether in the same or different buildings. What they find is, on average, people are somewhat more productive working from home, but it depends on who you are. Interestingly, female managers get the biggest boost, and the reason is they're helping out a lot of other people when they're in the office. So their personal productivity may go up when they're at home, but their team's productivity actually increases when they're in the office. And why female managers, that they hypothesize that female versus male managers may be more approachable in this software company, and they're also, as managers, they have more experience. So this is one of the issues about being very careful on performance evaluations, what to measure, because as part of their appraisal, you evaluated their team and their mentoring and support of others. They look like high performance on hybrid. If all you evaluate is narrowly how much lines of code they write, they look like highest performance when they're fully remote.
All right, and maybe last question for you. Put you on the spot here. If you had to, maybe predict is a strong word, envision what things are going to look like, let's say in 2 years and 5 years. So 2 years out from now, if we have you back on the podcast and we're having this conversation again, what do you think will be different 2 years from now versus today? And then if you were to imagine 5 years from now, what do you think things are going to be looking like?
So 2 years, I don't think a lot will change. So I don't think you'll have me back on the podcast because, I'd be a boring guest. But not much has changed over the last 2 years. It's now, coming on for summer 2025, and it looks very similar to summer 23.
Okay.
So 2 years from now, summer 27, I don't think there'll be a huge change. 5 and certainly 10 years is a lot easier to predict, which is...
It's interesting. Most people say that's harder to predict. I like you saying...
Yeah, well, in this case, it's easier. I think work from home, particularly hybrid, will have increased. Why is that? I have data going back to 1965 on levels of working from home, and it was doubling roughly every 15 years. Why? Because the technology is getting better. If you go back that span, I interviewed my parents. I'm one of 4 kids, and both of my parents worked, and so they would do it. And they said in the 80s it was terrible. It was carrying piles of paper and making expensive telephone calls. Then the personal computer came around in the 90s. Then you got the internet in the 2000s. Then you got cloud and video calls in 2010. So if we look 10 years out, there's going to be a fantastic set of technologies. For example, I suspect rather than having this call on laptops looking at small screens, we may be talking on full size wall-mounted things. So, Jacob, I could see your full body, your trousers, your shoes, your height. You just make it feel like a more personal connection. We may have, Jedi Council type headsets, all kinds of things like that. It's not that we will never meet again. It's just that maybe 3 days in the office, 2 from home, or reverse to say 2 in the office and 3 from home, because remote communication is just so much more effective.
Yeah, interesting. 15 years from now, man.
That's 2035. The other thing that's worth mentioning, by the way, that affects all of this is office lease length. So the JLL data shows the typical office lease is 12 years.
Yep.
And so right now, leases expiring, almost all for companies that signed those leases pre-pandemic. And that is another slow-moving oil tanker type thing that also, 10 years from now, pretty much every lease then has been signed post-pandemic.
And one last story before we wrap up. We hosted a CHRO event a few months ago. And one of the things that I found interesting, it was at this company that I won't mention, but they spent millions of dollars on this beautiful office. And they have a policy of work anywhere, wherever you want. It's no hybrid. It's just do what you want. And we had a bunch of CHROs come to this location, and it's a beautiful space. But we got there and we were doing a meeting. It was empty. Empty. It was a space designed to accommodate probably over 1,000 employees. You could hear a pin drop in this place. And the CHROs from different companies were walking around, and they're all kind of remarking, they're like, this would never work in our company to spend money. I mean, they saved money because they canceled other leases in other locations and invested in this beautiful space, but nobody was there. Nobody was showing up. And we were there for several days. And on each day we would show up and it was empty. So I guess that just goes to show that not having a policy and telling everybody to work wherever and however you want, probably also not the best strategy.
Yeah, I mean, often companies, there is another version. I mean, a version of fully remote that isn't quite fully remote is what tech firms do, which is, Airbnb type firms. There's a bunch of them that do this actually, which is you meet once in person, say for 2 days every other month. And if you're a large company with 20 teams, you can end up finding an office like that is actually reasonably busy with different teams coming in.
Yeah.
And it's still, you're not meeting in person as regularly, but if you've met somebody last month, there is some bond there. So generally what you see is fully remote where people work together. They have just never met ever is actually pretty rare. It tends to be more contractors. Even what's called, 5 days a week fully remote now in most big companies, they have offsites. But if you have a beautiful office like that, the natural thing to do is just offsite in the office.
Well, at the end of the day, I guess every company needs to do what makes sense for them. Do what makes sense for you. In a capitalist world, the market will decide. So if a company is making policies, employees, customers, they'll decide if they want to be a part of that organization or not. And it'll be interesting to see how the next few years play out. Dr. Nicholas Bloom, always a pleasure. Where can people go to learn more about you? I know you're very active on LinkedIn. You're posting a lot of really good research there. So anything you want to mention for people to check out?
Yeah, I mean, LinkedIn, I like LinkedIn a lot. It has, good informed discussion. I also have a website. As an academic, I have a website with research. But LinkedIn, I generally put nice kind of digestible.
Oh, yeah, you get a lot of comments on there, too. You get hundreds of comments, thousands of interactions on there. So people are just, they love your LinkedIn profile. So I'll make sure people check that out. It's Dr. Nicholas Bloom on LinkedIn.
Geez, I think if you just put Nick Bloom Stanford, it should come up.
Yeah, it pops up on there. It's pretty easy to find. Well, again, thank you so much for taking time out of your day. I really appreciate it. And I hope everybody listening and watching will connect with you on LinkedIn. And remember, Dr. Nicholas Bloom did not say never show up to the office. So stop sending his name and those links to everybody, because otherwise we're going to send them this podcast. Thanks again. Really appreciate it.
Okay, thanks very much, Jacob, for having me on.
Thanks for tuning in to today's episode of Future Ready Leadership. If you want to get access to more content on how you can become future ready, make sure to subscribe to the newsletter. It's thefutureorganization.com/newsletter. And if you enjoyed this episode, please send it to somebody who you would like to see become a better leader. Thanks for listening or watching, and I will see you next time.